JavaScript events have a very important property. They have a so-called capturing phase and a bubbling phase. So what does that mean? Well, let's find out. So here we have a very simple HTML document along with a DOM tree, but only for the anchor element that's represented in red here. So here we can see exactly all the parent elements of that red anchor element. And that's because we're going to simulate what exactly happens with an event when someone clicks on that link. So maybe pause the video for a minute and analyze this structure here. But anyway, let's now say that a click happens on the link. And as we already know, the DOM then generates a click event right away. However, this event is actually not generated at the target element, so at the element where the event happened, in this case the click on the anchor element. Instead, the event is actually generated at the root of the document, so at the very top of the DOM tree. And from there, the so-called capturing phase happens, where the event then travels all the way down from the document root to the target element. And as the event travels down the tree, it will pass through every single parent element of the target element. So in our example here, the HTML element, the body element, the section, then the paragraph, until it finally reaches its target. As soon as the event reaches the target phase begins, where events can be handled right at the target. And as we already know, we do that with event listeners such as this one. So event listeners wait for a certain event to happen on a certain element, and as soon as the event occurs, it runs the attached callback function. In this example, it will simply create this alert window. All right, and again, this happens in the target phase. All right, now after reaching the target, the event then actually travels all the way up to the document root again, in the so-called bubbling phase. So we say that events bubble up from the target to the document root. And just like in the capturing phase, the event passes through all its parent elements. And really just the parents, so not through any sibling elements. So as an event travels down and up the tree, they pass through all the parent elements, but not through any sibling element. But now you might be wondering, why is this so important? Why are we learning about all this detail? Well, it is indeed very important because basically it's as if the event also happened in each of the parent elements. So again, as the event bubbles through a parent element, it's as if the event had happened right in that very element. What this means is that if we attach the same event listener also, for example, to the section element, then we would get the exact same alert window for the section element as well. So we would have handled the exact same event twice, once at its target and once at one of its parent elements. And this behavior will allow us to implement really powerful patterns, as we will see throughout the rest of this section. So this really is very, very important to understand. Now, by default, events can only be handled in the target and in the bubbling phase. However, we can set up event listeners in a way that they listen to events in the capturing phase instead. Also, actually, not all types of events do have a capturing and bubbling phase. Some of them are created right on the target element, and so we can only handle them there. But really, most of the events do capture and bubble, such as I described it here in this lecture. We can also say that events propagate, which is really what capturing and bubbling is. It's events propagating from one place to another. All right, so I hope that all of this made sense, and so let's now actually see this in action in the next video. So let's now see event propagation in practice, and mainly event bubbling. And we're going to do that by attaching event handlers to this navigation link here, and also all of its parent elements. Then, as we click this link, we will give all these elements random background colors, and this will then allow us to visualize exactly how event bubbling is happening. And it will make sense once you see it actually working. And let's actually start by creating that random color that I just mentioned. And the random color is basically just a string like RGB, and then with a value between 0 and 255. So here with commas, actually. And so you see that VS Code is already showing this as a color. So let's start with the random number generator. And this one I will simply write now because we already did it in the previous section. So that's going to be math.floor. So maybe I could have just copied this code here, but then it would appear that this code simply magically appears, and I don't really like that when I'm watching a tutorial myself. Okay, so this was the formula that we used before to generate a random integer, and now we can use that to create a random color. So random color, and let's use another arrow function here. And so now we simply need to follow this formula here. So here we need random int, and as I said, with a value between 0 and 255. So this, and then 3 times. Okay, and that's it. Let's just check it out. 255. Oh, that's not what I wanted. So you see that random colors keep appearing down there now. Okay, but now let's actually attach the event handlers that I was mentioning. So I want to attach an event handler to this link and then to the parent elements as well. So let's check our HTML. And so the link itself is the nav link. And then let's attach an event handler also to nav links. So that's going to be this entire header there. Let me actually show it to you here. So I'm going to use this link here. So you see it's appearing in blue up there. So this link, then this whole element, and then also this entire header here. So that's with the class of nav. So document.query selector. And here we are actually going to need the event. And then as always, just to see if it works. And it does. So let's now grab some of these others. So there's links and nav. Remember, so that's the 3 that we want to use here. And so anyone that we click now, we will see link. So for now, that doesn't really matter, because what I want to show you now is what happens when we assign a random background color to first starting with this one. So we can say this, and remember that in an event handler, the this keyword points always to the element on which that event handler is attached. So in this case, that's going to be this link. All right. So we say this dot style dot background color and set it equal to a random color. And for now, let's just get rid of these here just to see if this works. Oh, and now we see this is jumping around, and that's because of this hash there. So let me get rid of this for now. And this here as well. And now as we click, it reloads the page. So what we need here is this, I guess. And so yeah, now it works. And so as we click here, we see that the color of this element keeps changing. But now, what if we perform the exact same action on the parent element? So let's copy this and put it here. And again, keep in mind that this nav_links element is the parent of this link. So it's all of this block here. So when I click this link now here, what do you think is going to happen to the nav_links element? So to that whole container? Well, let's see. And you see that the container also got its own random background color. So based on what we learned in the last video, why do you think this is happening? Well, just as we learned before, the event actually happens at the document root, and from there it then travels down to the target element. And so in this case, that is this link. And then from there it bubbles up. And bubbling up means that basically it's as if the event had also happened in all of the parent elements. And so that is the reason why this exact event is now also being handled by this event listener here that is on nav_links. Okay? So again, it is as if the click event here on this link had also happened right here in this element. So in the nav_links element. All right? So both of these handlers here are now handling the same event which happened here on this link. And as we keep clicking, of course, the same keeps happening. Now, what do you think happens when we click only outside here? So only in the nav_links? Well, let's see. So you see that the color on the link itself keeps unchanged. And that's because this is the parent element. And so from here, the event only bubbles up to its parent elements. So let's see what happens when we actually also paste this here into this whole nav bar. So let's see. And indeed, now the click event that happened here was indeed handled in all three places. So in all three elements which have a click event handler. Great. But let's now dig a little bit deeper and talk about the event target. So here let me log to the console, first saying that this is the link, and then event.target. And the target is essentially where the event originated. So where the event first happened. So this is not the element on which the handler is actually attached. Okay? So again, this is where the event happened. So in this case, where the click happened. And it is not the element on which the event handler was attached. So let me put the same here also. And let's call this one here the container and the nav. Okay. And now watch what happens again when I click on this link. Okay. So one more time, all the three elements got a random background color. And you see that the target, which is this one here, is always the same. Okay. So in all three handlers, the target element will always be the same. And that's, of course, the element where the click first happened. And it appears in all the three handlers because all of them are essentially handling the exact same event. So this E here, so this event that each of them receives, is indeed the exact same event. And again, that is because of event bubbling. So the event originates here in this link, but then it bubbles up to its parent element, which is this one, and from there to its next parent element, and from there it will travel even further up in the DOM tree. And so we can then handle that event in all of the parent elements, and that is exactly what we did here. All right. Now, besides the target, there's actually also the current target. So let me log that here as well. And the current target is indeed the element on which the event handler is attached. So e.currentTarget, and here e.currentTarget. So if we do this now, then you will see that the current target is not the same. Well, in the link it is, of course, because that's where the event happened, and it's also where the handler is attached to. But then here, it is, of course, the nav links, so the container, and here the whole navigation element. All right, and so you might have noticed that the current target is exactly the same as the this keyword, right? So the this keyword is also the one pointing to the element on which the event listener is attached to, so such as we used here. And all of this is important to know when you really want to gain a deep understanding of the DOM and how it works. So here you see we got indeed true. So the this keyword and event.currentTarget are going to be exactly the same in any event handler. Another thing that I wanted to show you is that we can actually stop the event propagation. So let me show that to you. Propagation. And so all we have to do is to simply call on the event stop propagation. And that's it. So when we try to do the same thing now, watch what happens. So now the two parent elements did not change their background colors, which means that the event never arrived at those elements, right? That's why they weren't handled there. And again, that is because we stopped the propagation right here, okay? And so the propagation phase then never happened for this event. And therefore, these events never reached this element and also not this element. All right? Now, in practice, that's usually not a good idea to stop propagation, but I still showed it to you here in case you really need it sometime. So stopping the event propagation like this can sometimes fix problems in very complex applications with many handlers for the same events. But in general, it's not really a good idea to stop the propagation of events. So as we just saw, these three event handlers that we set up here receive events from the target elements and also from the bubbling phase, right? So in other words, the event handler functions are listening for click events that happen on the element itself, like this, right? Or like this, and where now, of course, only the background color of this one changes. And they're also listening for events that keep bubbling up from their child elements. And that's the reason why the color changes in all of the parent elements here as well. So the two phases that I just described are phase 2 and phase 3 in the slide that we saw in the last video, right? But now, what about the capture phase? So that was phase 1. Well, as we learned, events are captured when they come down from the document root all the way to the target. But our event handlers are not picking up these events during the capture phase. Remember that? So I mentioned that add-event-listener here is only listening for events in the bubbling phase, but not in the capturing phase. So that is the default behavior of the add-event-listener method. And the reason for that is that the capturing phase is usually irrelevant for us. It's just not that useful. Now, on the other hand, the bubbling phase can be very useful for something called event delegation. So that's something that we're going to do in the next lecture. However, if we really do want to catch events during the capturing phase, we can define a third parameter in the add-event-listener function. So for example here, we can set the third parameter to true or false. And so let's set it to true. And so in this case, where this useCapture parameter is set to true, the event handler will no longer listen to bubbling events, but instead to capturing events. Now in practice, that's going to look the same here. Okay, but as we take a look here in our log, you will see that now the nav is actually the first appearing. And let's clear that here and see it again. So you see that now the first element through which the event passes is the navigation. And the reason for that is that this element is now actually listening for the event as it travels down from the DOM, while these other ones are listening for the event as it travels back up. And so that happens later, and therefore the nav is now the first one to show up, because this of course is the first one to happen. Because first the event travels down all the way to the target, and only then it bubbles back up. And so these other two event handlers here, they are looking for bubbling events, and so therefore they are going to happen after this first one. Now they're still all working with the same event, they're simply doing it in different phases of the event propagation. And if that sounds confusing, then please take another look at the slide that I showed you in the last video. You can imagine that slide maybe with these elements that we're working with here, and then picture the event traveling down and up again, and how we capture it here in the capturing phase. So with this flag here set to true. So I hope that made sense, but let's now actually get rid of this. So by default, this is set to false, and so getting rid of this is the same as setting this argument to false. So as I said, capturing is actually rarely used these days. And the only reason why both capturing and bubbling actually exist is only for historical reasons. So from the time where different browsers implemented different versions of JavaScript. But anyway, what really matters that you really understand here is that why these three boxes here get three different background colors, even though the click only happened on this element. And I think I made that really clear in this video and also in the last one. Let's now use the power of event bubbling to implement something called event delegation. So what we're going to do is to implement a smooth scrolling behavior in the navigation, so that when we click one of these links here, it will then automatically scroll smoothly to the corresponding section. All right. So right now, as we click one of these links, it actually moves there, but of course we want this to happen smoothly. And so let's now go ahead and use event delegation to implement this navigation. And actually, let's do that here at the top of the file. So here in the beginning, I will have all the code that is actually really related to the page, while down here we then have the code that we have been using to experiment with some stuff. All right. So page navigation comes right here after the model window. Let's grab this separator code here. And in fact, we can also put this code here, which was for scrolling. So this code, we also need it active in order to make this button here work, right? So let's put that actually here second. And okay. This here. All right. And these selections, I will put all of them here at the top. All right. So that's a little bit of a nicer organization, having, just like in the last project, all of the selection in one nice line. All right. Now we get this error here that button scroll to has already been declared. Oh, and that's because we actually wanted to cut this code. So we no longer want it here. Okay, so with this, we cleaned it up a little bit. And so let's now go actually to the place in code where we want to implement the page navigation. Now let's actually first implement this without using event delegation so that you can see the problem in the approach that we've been using so far. And so let's now select all of these 3 links here. So document.query selector, and actually it's got to be query selector all. And then, as we already saw in the previous video, they are called nav __ a link. Okay, so this will return a node list, and now we can use the for each method in order to attach an event handler to each of the elements that are in the node list. So actually just as we did up here, right? Okay, so for each, and so or callback function here, which gets access to the current element in the node list. And so to each element, let's now use the add event listener method. So a click, and then another callback function. So now we have callback inside of callback, but that's not a problem at all. All right, so here we again want access to the event. And now let's just start by logging to console link just like this. So indeed we get link here and on this one and also on this one. So 3 times link. Now you already start to see the problem, which is that by default, clicking one of these links will scroll to the position in the HTML. And that's because of these so-called anchors. Let me show it to you in the HTML. And so these here are called anchors. So hash and then some name here will automatically move the page to the element which has the ID of this. So let's see, down here we have, here we have this section with the ID section 2. And so as we click here then, it will automatically move to exactly that section. And we can see it here also in the URL bar, right? So we basically need to prevent that from happening. Let me just put this back here because in the last lecture, we deleted this section 1 that was here. And so as I was saying, we need to prevent this default behavior. And so for that, we use once more event, or E in this case, dot prevent default. And so let's see now. And indeed, now nothing happens. So we no longer scroll to the page. And you see that the URL bar is actually also no longer changing as we click here. So that problem is fixed. And so now let's implement the smooth navigation, or the smooth scrolling actually. Because if we didn't want the scrolling to be smooth, then we actually wouldn't need any of this, because we already saw that the browser will actually automatically move to that place, so to that anchor that we defined in HTML. Now, that anchor, however, so basically this part here is still going to be very useful, because we can now take this href attribute. So basically we can take this value here and select the element that we want to scroll to based on this. Because if we think about this, this actually looks pretty much like a selector for an ID, right? So let me write the code here, and then I will explain a little bit more. So let's get that href actually, and I'm going to call it ID. So that is at this, which is the current element, remember, dot get attribute, and then the href. Okay, and I used the get attribute function here because, as we learned before, I actually only want that part that we literally write here. So I don't want the absolute URL, and so And so that's why I cannot write simply this dot href. Remember that? Anyway, let's now log this to the console to see again what we're doing here. And so you see we get now section 1 here, 2 and 3. And now, as I was saying before, this here looks pretty much like a selector already. And so we can now take this and select an element based on this, and then simply scroll to that element. So for that, we're going to use the scroll into view method here again. So let me show that to you. So document.querySelector, and now all I need to pass in is this ID, right? Because again, this exact string that we get from the href attribute is already the perfect selector, so we can just use that. Okay? And so this is a pretty common technique that we use for implementing a navigation like this. So we put the ID of the element that we want to scroll to here in the href attribute, so that then in the JavaScript we can read that. So we can read that href, and then we can select the element that we want to scroll to. So in this case, it's the element with the ID section 1. And that is exactly this one here. So exactly the first section. All right. So here we have the element now selected. And now all we need is to call scroll into view, and then with behavior set to smooth, just like we did already here before. Okay. And that's actually already it. So that worked beautifully, right? All right, and now the third one, and here we go. Well, that didn't really scroll to where I thought it should go. But now it did. Apparently, something weird happened there, but that's not a problem. Now, as you see, this actually works just fine, but the problem is that it's not really efficient. So we are adding here the exact same callback function. So this event handler here, we are adding it once to each of these 3 elements. So the exact same function is now attached to these 3 elements. And that's kind of unnecessary. I mean, of course, it would be fine for only 3 elements, but what if we had 1,000 or like 10,000 elements? If we would attach an event handler to 10,000 elements like this, so like we did here with the for each function, then we would effectively be creating 10,000 copies of this same function here. And so that would then certainly impact the performance. And it's really just not a clean solution in that case. And so the better solution, without a doubt, is to use event delegation. So in event delegation, we use the fact that events bubble up. And we do that by putting the event listener on a common parent of all the elements that we are interested in. And so in our example, it's this container that's around all of these links that we saw in the previous video. So remember, that is this element here. So we will put our event handler on this element here, and then when a user clicks one of the links, the event is generated and bubbles up just as we saw in the last video. And then we can basically catch that event in this common parent element and handle it there, because we also know where the event actually originated, right? So we can figure that out by looking at the event.target property. So that's what event delegation is. And so let's now go ahead and implement it. All right. So in event delegation, we basically need 2 steps. First, we add the event listener to a common parent element of all the elements that we're interested in. So let me actually write that here, because this is a really important technique. So as I said, add event listener to common parent element. And then in that event listener, determine what element originated the event, so that we can then work with that element where the event was actually created. So let's do that. Document.querySelector. And so remember, the common element of all these links is nav links. So again, it's this. Yeah, it's this element. And so this is where we add the event listener. And now we just need to figure out where the event actually happened. And remember that that is stored in event.target, right? So event.target becomes really, really useful now in this strategy, because we can now use this information exactly to basically see where that event happened. So as I click here, we can now see, well, that the event occurred from this element. And as we click here, then we see that it originated, of course, from this one. Okay? And as we click somewhere here in the middle, then we see that the click, of course, happened in this entire element, not in one of the links. And this part is actually important to notice, because now we actually only want to work with the clicks that happened on one of the links. So only this one or this one, but the click that happens here on this nav links element is not relevant at all. And so now we need a matching strategy here in order to match only the elements that we are actually interested in. All right. And in this case, the best way to do that is to simply check if the target has this navlink class. All right. So this is the matching strategy. And this can sometimes be one of the hardest things to come up when you use this technique. But many times I actually do it like this. So I check if the target element contains the class that we are interested in. So class list, and then remember we can use the contains method. And then we can simply check if it contains the class navlink. And so that's then this one here, right? And only if it does, then let's log link. So let's see. So as we click, we get link, you see, or another one, and we also get link. But then as we click somewhere else, like here in the middle, then we do not get link. All right. And so now we successfully basically only selected the link elements itself. And so now we can basically do exactly what we did here before. So we actually also need to prevent the default. And so let's get all of this. And replace that here. Get rid of the comments. And this one here, so preventing the default, we actually always want that, or to do that. So no matter where we are clicking, nothing should happen. All right. So let's try that. Oh, and here we get this error, and we get null on line 87. So that's this. Oh, and of course, we still have a problem here, because the href attribute is now not on this, but it is on the element that was clicked. And so that is again e.target. So that's the whole reason why we're using e.target in the first place. So let's try now. And beautiful. Now it actually works. So you see, we still get the same sections here also logged to the console, and it scrolls to exactly where we want it to go. Awesome. So this works beautifully. And yeah, we successfully implemented event delegation, which is a lot better and a lot more efficient than simply attaching the same event handler to multiple elements. Instead, we simply added one big event handler function to the parent element of all the elements that we're interested in, and then we simply determined where the click event came from. And then we also needed this matching strategy because we wanted to basically ignore clicks that did not happen right on one of these links. And coming up with this matching strategy, as I like to call it, is probably the hardest part of implementing event delegation. But don't worry, because there will be plenty of examples throughout the rest of the course. And so at some point, it will all make a lot of sense to you. So I hope that you're convinced that event delegation is a much better strategy, even though it requires a little bit more work than the first implementation that we did. And in fact, there is actually an even more important use case of event delegation, which is when we are working with elements that are not yet on the page on runtime, so by the time the page loads. And a great example are buttons that are added dynamically while using the application. So it's not possible to add event handlers onto elements that do not exist. But we will still be able to handle events on elements that don't exist at the beginning by using event delegation one more time. And we will actually do this later in this section. This lecture is going to be about traversing the DOM. So DOM traversing is basically walking through the DOM, which means that we can select an element based on another element. And this is very important because sometimes we need to select elements relative to a certain other element. For example, a direct child or a direct parent element. Or sometimes we don't even know the structure of the DOM at runtime. And in all these cases, we need DOM traversing. And this video is going to be another very nice reference lecture for you. And so let's now work with this h1 element here. And from here, we're going to go downwards, upwards, and also sideways. So let's quickly inspect this element. All right. So we see, so here we have the h1 element, and in there we have some text, we have some comments, then we have this span element, then some more text, and even more elements. And so this is going to be a lot of fun exploring a couple of different methods and properties to walk around this element. So let's start by selecting it. Maybe we already did that before somewhere, but that doesn't really matter. So let's start with going downwards. So basically selecting child elements. So the first way of doing that is to use query selector, because we already know that query selector also works on elements, not only on the document. So let's simply log to the console h1.querySelector, and then let's again see here what we could select. So we have this class highlight and this class highlight. So that's these two green ones. And so let's select them here. So that's actually query selector all, because there are two of them. And so class highlight. So let's take a look. And indeed, here they are. So this here indeed selects all the elements with the highlight class that are children of the h1 element. And that would work no matter how deep these child elements would be inside of the h1 element. Okay, and that's very important to notice. All right. Now in this case, these two elements here are direct children of the h1, but as I said, it would go down as deep as necessary into the DOM tree. Okay? And also, if there were other highlight elements on the page, so elements with this class, they would not get selected, because they would not be children of the h1 element. All right? So these are 2 points that are important to note here about query selector and query selector all. Now, sometimes all we need are actually direct children. And so for that, we can use h1.child nodes. So let's take a look. And so here we actually get all kinds of stuff. So we get text, we get a comment, and we get then these elements. And that's because we already know that nodes can be anything. So they can be text or elements or even comments, as we have here. Okay, so this really gives us every single node of every single type that there exists. But many times we are simply interested in the elements themselves, right? So if we wanted the text, we could use .text content or .inner HTML. So child nodes is not that used, but instead we can use children, just like this. And this then gives us an HTML collection, which remembers is a live collection, so it's updated. And so here we indeed only get the 3 elements that are actually inside of the h1. So that's this span, this breaking, and this span again. All right, but this one works only for direct children, so keep that in mind. Okay, finally, there's also first and last element child. So these names are a little bit confusing, but one more time, that's because of the messy nature of JavaScript with all of these things being implemented at different points in time. And so therefore it was difficult to keep consistent naming conventions. But anyway, let's use first element child. And so here it already is. Style.color, just so that I can show you that we can actually also set these properties or use them to set something like the style. So for example, we can do this, and then only the first child here gets now this color set to white. So basically that's this element here, which is the first element here of all the children. That's why it's called first element child. And we can of course do also last element child, and let's say this one to black. So it's a little bit different now. It used to be, let's say, orange red. I really like this one. And so now it looks a little bit more crazy. Okay, but now let's go upwards. So going upwards, so basically selecting parents. And for direct parents, it's actually very straightforward. So here we have h1.parent node. And so that one is similar to child nodes. So let's see. And so it's this header title. So as we open this up, we see that indeed this h1 here is inside of header title. And so this is the direct parent. And so that's why we get this. Then there's also the parent element, which is usually the one that we are interested in. But in this case, it's simply the same. All right, because this element is also a node in this case. All right. However, most of the time, we actually need a parent element, which is not a direct parent. Or in other words, we might need to find a parent element no matter how far away it is in the DOM tree. And for that, we have the closest method. So that's h1.closest. So let's say that on the page we had multiple headers, so multiple elements with the class of header. But for some reason, we only wanted to find the one that is a parent element of h1, so of our h1 element here. And so for that, we can use closest. And so the closest method receives a query string just like query selector and query selector all. All right. So dot header, and then let's do something with it. For example, change the background image, or just change the background. And I will set it here now actually to a CSS variable. So let me show that to you. So here we have all of these CSS variables, or as they are officially called, custom properties. And we use them in CSS by doing this. So by writing variable and then a color. And so, well, let's actually use a gradient. So gradient, yeah, so this one. Okay. Just so you can see that we can use custom properties also in CSS. So give it a save, and beautiful. Well, it's not that beautiful, I must say, but indeed it worked. So it selected the closest header to our h1 element, so the closest parent element that has this class, and then it simply applied our style to that element. So this is a very important one, and we're going to use it all the time, especially for event delegation. So take a note of that, or just keep it in mind. Now, if this selector here actually matches the element on which we're calling closest, then that's actually the element that's going to be returned. So let me also show that. So we are calling this on the h1 element. And so if we're looking for the closest h1, then that's going to be exactly the element itself. And so, as I just said, then that's going to be the one that will be returned. Let's make this a bit more prominent here. And so you see that indeed, now this is the h1 element itself. So we can think of closest here as basically being the opposite of query selector. So both receive a query string as an input, but query selector finds children no matter how deep in the DOM tree, while the closest method finds parents, and also no matter how far up in the DOM tree. All right. So very important method here to keep in mind. And now let's go sideways. So selecting siblings. And for some reason in JavaScript, we can only access direct siblings. So basically only the previous and the next one. So that's h1.previous element sibling, like this. And then there's also the next element sibling. All right. So the previous element sibling is null. And so if we take a look at that, it makes sense because there is nothing there. So this is the first child of this parent element, and therefore it doesn't have a previous sibling, but it has a next sibling. And so that's this h4 element, which comes after it. And just like before, we also have the same methods, or actually the same properties for nodes. So that's just previous sibling and next sibling. So let's see. And here the previous sibling is now actually text. So not sure what that is. Well, it's not really important because again, most of the time we're going to be working with the elements anyway. Now, if we really need all the siblings and not just the previous and the next one, then we can use the trick of moving up to the parent element and then read all the children from there. So let's see. So h1 dot parent element. So that's just like we learned before. So the direct parent, and then from there we can get all the children. So just like we learned here also before. So dot children. And so now we get all of the siblings. And that of course is going to include itself. So that's all of these elements, and all of them are siblings. And just for fun, let's actually do something with them here. So this is an HTML collection, remember, so it's one more time not an array, but it is still an iterable that we can spread into an array. So we can do this, and it will then create an array from this. And then we can loop over that array and do something using the for each method. So let's say that we wanted to change some style to all the siblings, but except the element itself. And actually that's more straightforward than you might imagine. So we can simply do this here. So we can check if the element is different or equal also works than the h1, because h1 is our original element itself. And so comparisons between elements actually work just fine. Okay? And so when the element is not the h1 itself, then let's change the style. And let's say we want the transform property just to scale them a little bit. Let's say 0.5. So scaling them by 50%. And indeed, all the other three siblings are now like 50% smaller. All right? And so this is how we can work with all the sibling elements of one element. Great. And that's actually the fundamentals of DOM traversing. And we're going to need them all the time, and especially when we're doing some more complex event delegation like we will do throughout the rest of this section. In this video, we're going to implement a very popular component, which is a tabbed component. And you will see tabbed components on many websites these days, so it's great to learn how to build one yourself. So the component that we're going to build in this video is this one. Now, a tabbed component can appear in many different ways, but what they all have in common is that they have some kind of tabs, like these here, and when you click the tab, then the content of this area below will change. And so that's exactly what happens here with these buttons. So basically these three are our tabs, and then as we click on one of the tabs, it will reveal the associated content. So a little bit like tabs here in our browser, right? So each browser tab has its own web page, and so here each tab has its own content area, basically. So I'm sure you've seen this on other websites, and so let's now go ahead and implement this ourselves. Okay. Now, for this component, we actually need a bunch of HTML. So let's first take a look at that. So the whole tabbed component in our case is called operations. So let's scroll down here also. And so this section here is about the operations we can do on a bank account, and therefore this component here is called operations. And you can also see that here on the page. Then we have the tab container, basically. So that's this element. And so you can also see it here again, and it's the element which will contain the three tabs. And so each tab is itself a button, and it has this class of operations tab. Okay. Then below that we have the content. And in fact, we have three contents. So we have one content element here for each of the tabs. All right. So the first one here, as you see, is called operations content 1. Then the other one is operations content 2 and operations content 3. So as we click on one of these tabs, we will not create any new content. What we will do instead is to hide the other tabs, basically. So you see that right now, this first one here has the operations content active class. And so therefore this one is visible and all the others are hidden. And what's also important here is that these buttons here, they have this data tab attribute. And so this one is number 1, and this will then be associated with this class name here. So operations content and then again 1. But more about that in a minute when we actually implement this ourselves. So for now, we just need to get down the basic structure of the HTML here. And it might be a good idea for you to pause the video and take a minute or two to get yourself familiar with this HTML structure and all of the class names that are involved here. Okay, and you can even take a look at the CSS, because there's also a lot of CSS involved here. All right, so of course I couldn't write all of this code here together with you now, because that would take way too long. All right, But anyway, let's now build this tabbed component here. And we're going to start by selecting the tabs. Okay, and I will keep the elements here open so we can see it at all time. And so you see that the buttons, they have the class operations tab. So tabs equal document.querySelector all, and then with the class operations tab. Then let's also select the tabs container. And so that is this element here. Let's actually go ahead and copy it. And finally, also the 3 content areas. So that's here, operations content. You see, cannot copy it for some reason. Doesn't matter. So tabs content is document.querySelector all. So because again, we have 3 of them. All right. So we have our selections nicely done. And now we can actually work on the functionality. And let's start by adding event handlers to these buttons here, right? Because that is the action that we actually want to handle in this component. So we could do it like this. So taking all the tabs, and then on each of them, we could attach an event handler. So for example, like this. So for each, because we want to do it on each of them, so we get then each tab, and then tab.add event listener, click, and let's just use a quick arrow function here, because this is really just a demonstration. Well, nothing happens. Let's try to reload this page. Yeah, indeed. Now we get the tab locked to the console. Now, however, as we already learned in the last video, doing this here is a bad practice. Because what if we had like 200 tabs? Then we would have 200 copies of this exact callback function here, and that would simply slow down the page. So that's not at all desirable. And so let's get rid of this, and one more time use event delegation. And remember that for event delegation, we need to attach the event handler on the common parent element of all the elements that we're interested in. And in our case, that is this tabs container, right? So we have our buttons here. So right here, our buttons, and the common parent of all of them is this tab container that we already selected previously. And so let's attach our event handler to that element instead. So tabs container.add event listener, click. We need the event, of course, so that we can figure out where the click happened. And so let's now actually work on our matching strategy. Okay, so we already know that we are interested in the buttons. And so let's now figure out which button was clicked. So let's actually create an element called clicked that we can then use to work with. And so what about this? So what about simply using the e.target? Well, let's see. So in our console, let's now click somewhere here. And indeed, now we got the button that was clicked. Okay. However, there is a problem when we click here on this number. So you see that now we did not get a button, but we got this span element. And that's because inside of this button, we actually have another element. And so now, even though it looked like we clicked on the button here, or here, for example, actually we are clicking on this span element, right? So we are not actually clicking on the button, but we still need the button. So no matter if we click on this button itself or here on the span element, we actually need the button element itself, because from that button we will need to read this data tab attribute here. Because as I mentioned earlier, this one contains the number of the tab that should become visible. And so here this data attribute becomes really important to store information in the DOM. So basically, we need a way of finding the button element whenever we click on this span element, right? Now, one simple way to fix it, which would not really fix it actually, is to do some DOM traversing and simply select the parent element. We can move up the DOM tree, and instead of simply taking e.target, we can use the parent element of that. So let's see what happens then. And so now indeed, when we click on the number, we get the button. And so again, that's because that is the parent element of that span. Now the problem appears when we click on the button itself, because now of course we will also get the parent of the button element. And so that is this container. But of course that is not what we want. So basically what we want is to get the button no matter if we click here on the span or on the button itself. So we need a way of selecting the parent element that is always a tab. And can you think of a special method that we learned previously to do that? Well, the solution is right here in the previous video. Well, and that's down here somewhere. So remember that we want a way of going upwards, but we want to specify that we want to select an operations tab. And so we can use this closest method for exactly that. So remember that I said that this method is going to be really helpful in event delegation. And so now that's actually the case. Okay, so this method makes it really easy for us to dynamically get the element that we're interested in. So here, instead of always selecting the parent element, we will search basically for the closest operations tab. And so here we need the exact same query as that. All right, and this should actually now fix our problem. So let's see. When we click the button itself, then we get the button. And when we click the number here, so the span, then we also get the button, because now it finds the closest parent with this class name, which indeed is the button itself, so the tab. And here we get the tab number 2, as you can see down here. And here we get tab number 3. Great. And let's actually immediately do something with this selected tab. So the tab that is currently active here has a different style, as you can see. So it's a bit moved up. And so that's because the active tab basically has this class. So where's that? It has this class of operations tab active. All right. So we can simply add that to the element that was just clicked. So class list dot add operations tab active. Okay, and now as we click, you see that it activates basically this tab. Now, of course, later, then all the other tabs will have to move down, but we're going to take care of that in a second. Because now watch what happens when we actually click on the tabs container itself. So outside of any of the buttons, but still in the tabs container where this event listener is actually attached to. So you see that we get null here. And that's because null is the result of the closest method here when there is no matching parent element to be found. So of course, when we click here in this tabs container, then there's going to be no parent with this class. And so therefore, as I just said, we get null. And so we need to fix that now in our code and basically ignore any clicks that happen on that area. So basically ignore any clicks where the result is then null. All right. So we can do that by saying if there is no clicked, then return immediately. And this is something that we haven't done before. So what I'm doing here is called a guard clause. So it's basically an if statement which will return early if some condition is matched. So in this case, when there's nothing clicked, then we want to immediately finish this function. And in this case, when we have null, which is a falsy value, then not falsy will become true, and then the function will return, and none of the code that's after it will be executed. But of course, if clicked does exist, then this return will not be executed, and the rest of the code will be executed just fine. So this is a more modern way of writing this. So we could have written instead also, if there is a clicked element, then do this. And this is the more traditional way, as we have been doing it all the time. But this is actually more modern because it looks a bit nicer, because we don't need to create all these additional blocks. So in this case, just this block. But sometimes when we have so many conditions, it can become a little bit confusing. And then it's a bit cleaner to simply return the function immediately if a certain condition is matched. And again, in this case, whenever there is no clicked element here, then we want to simply return the function right away. And so then that code here will not be executed. But otherwise, of course, it will be executed. And so let's now see what happens. So now clicking outside, nothing happens. Of course, we still get the null here, but no error occurs because now JavaScript is no longer trying to execute this line of code here. Okay. But now let's actually take care of basically putting all of these other buttons down, as I was saying. So when I click one of them, then the other ones should move down. So basically, we should remove this class from them, right? And so the solution to that is before we add this class here to anyone, we will simply remove it on all of the tabs. So we remove them on all. So that's all the tabs, dot for each. And so each tab I'm simply calling T here, and then tab dot class list dot remove. And so now that should work. And yeah, it does. Okay, so this is something that we do quite usually. So basically clearing the class on all of them and then only add it afterwards on one of them. So let's add a comment here, active tab. But now finally, let's actually activate the content area itself, because that's the main part that we're actually interested in. Now, remember that the information about which content area should be displayed is here in this data attribute. So let me click again. And so in this case, we want the tab number 2. And so that's this number 2 is encoded here basically in this data attribute. So having the number 2 here means that we want to select the element which has the class of operations content 2. Okay, so let's do that. Let me grab this here. So this selector, and then let's select it. So document.querySelector. And now I'm using a template string here because, of course, we don't want to hardcode the number 2 here, but instead we want to get that exactly from the data attribute that I just showed you. So let me just show that again to you. Now we got an error here. Let's just put something there for now. So it is called data tab. Okay. And so remember, all these attributes are in the element and then in the dataset property. So the element that was clicked is indeed stored in our variable clicked. right? So every time we click a button, that button is then stored in the clicked variable. And so then .dataset.tab. So that's only the part after the data, remember? So it's just tab. So in this case, it's going to be 2. And so we already have that now selected, and then we want to add a special class to it. So that's class_list.add. And let's just check out the class that we need to add. So we can see that here on the first content area, which is already active. And so the class here is operations content active. Okay, and one more time, you can check out the CSS to figure out why actually this makes the element active. And we can quickly do that ourselves. So here it is, actually, the active, right? And so basically what this does is to change the display property to something which is not none. So previously, without this active part, so just operation content makes it display none, which basically hides it. But then as it becomes active, we give it display grid and then specify all of these properties there. All right. So this should actually already be working. Just to really see this a bit better in the console also, let's log this value also to the console. Okay, but let's see. And indeed, it now appeared down here. Great. So it's no longer hidden. And indeed, we successfully read that value here from the data tab, which is 2. And the same is going to happen here for 3. And so you see that the content number 3 also appeared down here. Now, of course, this is not quite finished yet because we want the other ones to be hidden. So that's the whole idea of this component. And so basically all we need to do is to do the same that we did for the tabs. So basically removing the active class for all of them before then adding it to the one that we're interested in. All right, so basically just what we have here. So let's select all the contents, and that we actually already have here, right? So tabs content is also a node list because of query selector all that we can now loop over and then remove that active class from all of them. So tabs content dot for each, and I'm just calling it C very short here. So C for content. So class list remove. And so you see that it's always the same idea. So it's all about removing and adding classes to manipulate the page to look just like we want. All right. So this comment is actually more here. So activate tab. And here, remove the active classes for both the tab and the content areas. And with this, actually our component should already be working. So let's see. And yeah, beautiful. It works great. All right, let's just get rid of all these different console.logs here because we only need them for development. But now we're done. So let's just quickly recap. And as I just mentioned a minute ago, the whole idea when we build components like this is to just add and remove classes as necessary to manipulate the content to our needs. And actually the exact same thing we did with the modal window. So if you take a look at the code, it's a bit similar. So to hide and display the modal window, all we do is to add and remove this hidden class. Now in this case, it's a little bit more complex, but the idea is always the same. It's to work with classes that have some styles for showing and hiding the classes. And so if you're not yet really familiar with CSS, it's also important that you really check out the CSS to build these components for yourself. And the same goes for the HTML. But of course, I could not write this code here as well, because then this tutorial would take like 1 hour instead of 15 minutes. But anyway, I hope that this was fun. Make sure to understand what we did here, including the HTML and CSS, and then let's go right to the next video. Let's now create a nice effect on our page navigation where all the links fade out when we hover over one of them, except for the link that we actually hovered over. And this will teach us something really valuable, which is how to pass arguments into event handler functions. And the effect that I mean is this one. So when we hover over one of the links, you see all the others fade out like this, and that includes even the logo there on the left side. So let's do that here in our page, and let's again start by taking a look here at the HTML. So we have these links. So each of them is a nav link. And so these are the elements that we're going to be working with. So menu fade animation. But now, of course, we do not want to attach an event listener to each of these links. So we already know that we should do event delegation here instead. So let's find the common parent element of all of the links, and also including the logo there. So if we were only working with the links, it would be this element, but we also want to work with the logo here. And so let's actually use this entire navigation here as our parent container on which we will handle the event that is going to bubble up from the links. So keep in mind that all of this works because events bubble up from their target. So let's select the navigation here and store it in a variable .querySelector.nav. Okay, and actually let me put this here at the very top because we are going to need this a bit later. And it is a good practice to have all of these at the top. And the same actually here. So why not have all of the selections right at the top? That makes it a bit easier to understand the whole file. Okay. But anyway, let's now attach an event listener to that navigation. But now we're not going to use the click event, but instead the mouse over event. Okay. And I think that previously we have already used the mouse enter event, and mouse over is actually similar to mouse enter, with the big difference that mouse enter does not bubble. Okay. But here we need the event to actually bubble so that it can even reach the navigation element. And so therefore we use mouse over. All right. So then attach the function here. And there are also kind of opposite events of mouse over and mouse enter. And we use these to basically undo what we do on the hover. So the opposite of mouse enter is mouse leave, and the opposite of this mouse over is mouse out. And so we're also going to need that one. So let's put that here right away. So mouse out. All right. And as always, if you need to know more, then you can check out the MDN documentation. Great. So we have our parent element. And now, as always, we need to match the element that we are actually looking for. And so in this case, that are these elements with the navlink class on them. And so let's simply check for that. So if e.target, as you already know, .classlist.contains the navlink class, well, then let's do something. So you see that this time around, I'm not using the closest methods. And that's because there are simply no child elements that we could accidentally click here in this link, right? So that was the reason why we needed the closest method here in this tabs, because we had this button, but then we could also click on the span element. And so here we then needed to find the closest element, so the closest button to both of these places. Okay, but here that's not necessary. And so therefore a simple check like we have here is enough. And so now we can actually say that the clicked is then e.target. Okay, so I called it clicked before. Let's call it now actually the link. But this is similar to what we did before also. So creating a variable which contains the element that we're working with. All right, and so now next up we need to select the sibling elements. So basically all the other links. All right, and remember that we can do that by going to the parent and then selecting the children from there. Now, in this case, actually the parent of nav_link is this nav item. And the only thing that nav item includes is always just one link. So you see that each of the link is actually inside of one nav item like this. And so now we would have to move up manually, not just once, but twice. And so instead of doing that, we will again use the closest method. Okay. So again, instead of moving up manually like 1 or 2 steps, we can simply search for a parent which matches a certain query. And so that's a bit more robust, because even if we would then at some point maybe change the structure of this HTML here, then our JavaScript would keep working. All right, so let's say or link, and then find the closest parent, and let's actually search for nav again. Okay, even though that's not the closest parent, I mean there is another parent to these links, which is this one here, but it's no problem of also choosing an even higher up parent like we are doing here. So we are now at a parent of all of the links, and so now from there we can search for the nav links again. And so these are then going to be the siblings of our initial links. And so, as we already learned before, we can use query selector on an element to search for a certain query only in that element. Okay, and we are looking for these nav links, of course. And now let's actually also select the logo, and we could select it manually also by its class name, but let's just suppose that there are many navigations on this page. And so again, to make the solution really robust, it's best to simply move up to the closest parent, in this case the navigation, and then from there we simply search for an image. All right, and so this then will work not only on this navigation, but it would work also on others. So this selector here is simply for any image which has the image tag. Okay, all right, so we have all our elements selected. Now we just need to change the opacity basically of the siblings of the selected link. So siblings dot for each, and now we actually need to do that comparison that we did before. So checking if the current element is not the link itself, because of course this sibling here, so these siblings, they will contain our initial link as well. Okay, so it needs to be different from link, and actually here we need a query selector all, right? We want all the links, not just the first occurrence. Okay, but then for all the others that are not the original link, we want to change the opacity to 0.5. And indeed, we want to do the same with the logo. So logo.style. And let's see what we have already. And you see that it works, right? Beautiful. Now, the thing is that, of course, it doesn't go back. So once we have it at 0.5, it will not automatically go back to the opacity of 1, which is the original one. You see? So when I hover this, all the others become 0.5, but as I move out, then everything remains the same. Okay? And so that's why we have this mouse out event to basically undo what we did here. So let's take all of this, paste it here, and change this to 1. All right. And so let's see what happens now. And yeah, everything goes back to 1. And so this actually works. Now, of course, it doesn't work with the logo because this entire effect only works if the target contains the navlink class, right? But that wasn't the point anyway. We just wanted this to work on any of the links. And notice that this button here is actually also a link element, and so it also works on that one. All right. So our effect here is actually working already, but this is of course very repetitive. So the code here is always the same, and so we need to make our code a little bit more dry here, of course. So let's refactor this code. And usually refactoring works by creating a new function. And so let's do that here. Of function, and we will need some arguments here, but more about that later. So what we need to do now is to compare these two pieces of code that we are trying to refactor, and then figure out what is the same and what is different. So in this case, that's pretty simple. So all that changes is that here we have the opacity 0.5, and here we have the opacity of 1. And so we can simply take this code and create an argument or a parameter for that opacity. And we can then pass that opacity into the function. All right. So of course we also need the event here. So that's going to be the first one. And then we need the opacity. And so here we simply replace that by opacity. Okay. And so like this, we refactored our code very nicely here. But now, how do we actually use this function here? So usually when we have the event handler as a separate function, all we do here is to pass in that function, and then it's going to work just like this, right? So we have done this many times throughout this course, right? But now the problem is that we actually want to pass in values into this function, right? So we need to tell this function to use the opacity of 0.5 in this case and of 1 in this case. All right. Also, we need a way of passing this event. So right now, none of this would work. So let me show that to you. So not clicking, of course, but you see it would not really work. Okay. So maybe you would think that we could do this. So like maybe passing an event here and then 0.5, which is the opacity that we want. But this, of course, is not going to work. So the first problem is that E is, of course, not defined. But the main problem really here is that addEventListener here expects a function. So we need to pass a function. But if we call the function, then all of this here will become some other value. In this case, that's undefined because we don't return anything from this function. All right. And so this is simply not going to work. So we talked about this many times, but it's always good to remember that JavaScript indeed expects here a function and not just some other regular value, which would be the result of calling the function like this. Now the solution to this problem would be to still have a callback function here, like a regular one, which JavaScript will then call for us whenever the event happens. And then in here, we could then actually call this function with the event, which is this one, and then our opacity, so 0.5. And so this works because here we are basically calling the function manually. So this will only be executed as soon as JavaScript executes this function value. And so here we are back to working because here we are back to passing in a real function. Okay. And then let's right away do the same here. Set it to 1. And now it should be working again. And it does indeed. Okay, so that is the second version of our code working, but we can actually do even better and remove these anonymous callbacks functions here altogether. So this looks a little bit ugly, right? Like having just this one function, which in turn will call another function. And so as I just said, we can do even better, and that is by using the bind method that we already studied before. So remember that the bind method creates a copy of the function that it's called on, and it will set the this keyword in this function call to whatever value that we pass into bind. Okay, so let me just do that here in practice. So handle hover and then dot bind. Okay, and I think we actually already did an example like this. So using bind in an event handler. And so let's set 0.5 here just as before. All right, and now let's do the same here. So handle hover dot bind and then 1. And so this is going to work because this is going to be also a function, because bind, remember, returns a new function. Now in this function, the this variable will now be set to this value, so to 1 here and to 0.5. And so let's check that out. So the this variable, okay. And so now you see indeed that it is either 1 or 0.5. All right. Now remember that usually the this keyword is equal to current target. So let's also check that. Okay, but current target will of course remain unaltered. So you see that it is still of course the navigation element. Okay, so by default the this keyword is the same as the current target, so the element on which the event listener is attached to. But when we then set the this keyword manually, of course it becomes whatever we set it to. And so now, just like before, we can use that this keyword and use that here. All right, because the this keyword is now our opacity. And so essentially we use the bind method here to pass an argument into a handler function. So let me just write that here. Passing an argument into handler. And I'm using quotes here because, of course, this is not really an argument. So in fact, we don't even need this here. And in fact, it is impossible to pass another argument into an event handler function. So any handler function like this one can only ever have one real argument. And so in this case, can only ever have one real parameter, and that is the event. But if we want to pass additional values into the handler function, then we need to use the this keyword like we just did here. And if we wanted multiple values, then we could, of course, pass in here like an array or an object instead of just one value. So this is kind of a workaround into the fact that the handler function can only take one argument. So it's a really nice effect, and as I said in the beginning, it also taught us how we can pass arguments essentially into handler functions.